Okay. Didn't want the, no, no. There we go. As you can tell, I'm still new to this. Oh, I don't even need this light. But it decided to rain today. Oh, that actually looks pretty good. Oh, hi, madam. Yeah, I was this close to not streaming today because I got pretty much the final pieces of like the final pieces of that sewing. Pretty much one of the many sewing projects I've got going on right now. Got the final pieces all cut out, so I was just like, oh, I can just, stick them in the sewing machine and go, and then I was just like, no, the reason I did the Twitch is so that I can put myself, I have to do this. It keeps me, what is it? Doesn't make my ADD, like it forces me to combat ADD. So last time we left off on Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, which, yes, this book is banned in my home state. Last time we left off, we were we met Mr. Wickham. We also met the cousin. We've already met the cousin, Mr. Collins, in the last. Yeah, we had met Mr. Collins in chapter 14, I think. 13 or 14, which was yeah, enjoy your box. So yeah, I think we're getting ready for the dance at Netherfield, and we'll continue. Chapter 18. Till Elizabeth entered the drawing room at Netherfield and looked in vain for Mr. Wickham among the cluster of red coats there assembled, a doubt of his being present had never occurred to her. She had dressed with more than usual care and prepared in the highest spirits for the conquest of all that remained unsubdued of his heart, trusting that it was not more than might be won in the course of the evening. But in an instant arose the dreadful suspicion of his being purposely omitted for Mr. Darcy's pleasure in the Bingleys' invitation to the officers. And though this was not exactly the case, the absolute fact of his absence was pronounced by his friend Denny, who told them that Wickham had been obliged to go to town on business the day before to attend a demonstration of the new carriage that boasted of being impervious to attacks by the Mankey dreadfuls. This assured Elizabeth that Darcy was not answerable for Wickham's absence, and her every feeling of displeasure against the former was sharpened by the immediate This assured Elizabeth that Darcy was not answerable for Wickham's absence, and her every feeling of displeasure against the former was sharpened by immediate disappointment. She was resolved against any sort of conversation with him. Having told all her griefs to Charlotte Lucas, whom she had not seen for a week, Elizabeth was soon able to make a voluntary transition to the oddities of her cousin and to point him out to her Elizabeth was soon able to make a voluntary transition to the oddities of her cousin and to point him out to her particular notice. The first two dances, however, brought a return of distress. They were dances of mortification. Mr. Collins, awkward and uncommonly round, gave her all the shame and misery which a disagreeable partner for a couple of dances can give. The moment of her release from him was ecstasy. She danced next with an officer, and had the refreshment of talking of Wickham, and of hearing that he was universally liked. When those dances were over, she returned to Charlotte Lucas, and was in conversation with her, when she found herself suddenly addressed by Mr. Darcy, who took her so much by surprise in his application for her hand that, without knowing what she did, she accepted him. He walked away again immediately, and she was left to fret over her own want of presence of mind. If Master Liu had seen such a lapse of awareness, 20 lashes at least, and another 20 trips up and down the 1,000 steps of Quan Hissy, HSI, Hissy, Quan Sai. I don't think they pronounce the H. Okay, that's just me. That one's on me. I dare say you will find Mr. Darcy very agreeable, Charlotte tried to console her. Heaven forbid! That would be the greatest misfortune of all. When the dancing recommenced, however, and Darcy approached to claim her hand, Charlotte could not help cautioning her in a whisper not to be a simpleton and to allow her fancy for Wickham to make her appear unpleasant in the eyes of a man 10 times his consequence. Elizabeth made no answer and took her place in the set. They stood for some time without speaking a word, and she began to imagine that their silence was to last through the 2 dances, and at first was resolved not to break it, till suddenly, fancying that it would be the greater punishment to her partner to oblige him to talk, she made some slight observation on the dance. He replied, and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him a second time with, "It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some sort of remark on the size of the room or the number of couples." He smiled and assured her whatever she wished him to say would be said. "Very well, that reply will do for the present. Perhaps, by and by, I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones. On the contrary, I find that balls are very much more enjoyable when they cease to remain private." Oh, now I look like I'm in some horror movie. I did not notice that. Hold up. That's the joys of being in the rainy season. I mean, this is a zombie book, so the horror lighting would be appropriate, wouldn't it? Curse you, fickle weather. Don't want that to. No, actually, I was having trouble because that one spotlight was kind of getting annoying to when I was trying to read. I kind of like more the diffuse so I can see the whole page. So let's see how this works. It's still a bit horror, but not as annoying on me. Okay. On the contrary, I find that balls are much more enjoyable when they cease to remain private. Elizabeth could not help but blush, but she was determined that her face betray not the slightest hint of amusement. Instead, she replied archly, "I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak, unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room, or be regarded as uncommonly clever." "This was no very striking resemblance of your own character, I am sure," he said. "How near it may be to mine, I cannot pretend to say. You think it a faithful portrait, undoubtedly." "I must not decide of my own performance." He made no answer, and they were again silent until they had gone down the dance, when he asked her if she and her sisters did not often meet with zombies on their walks to Merton. She answered in the affirmative, and, unable to resist the temptation, added, "When you met us there the other day, we had just been forming a new acquaintance." The effect was immediate. A deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features, but he said not a word. And Elizabeth, though blooming herself, and by the way, this is a long chapter, so I'm gonna be The effect was immediate. A deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features, but he did not say a word. And Elizabeth, though blaming herself for her own weakness, could not go on. At length Darcy spoke, and in a constrained manner said, "Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain." "He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship," replied Elizabeth with emphasis, "and his ability to walk for a 12-month, I understand." Darcy made no answer, and seemed desirous of changing the subject. At that moment Sir William Lucas appeared close to them, meaning to pass through the set to the other side of the room. But on perceiving Mr. Darcy, he stopped with a bow of superior courtesy to compliment him on his dancing and his partner. "I have been most highly gratified indeed, my dear sir. Such very superior dancing is not often seen. It is evident that you belong to the first circles. Allow me to say, however, that your fair partner does not disgrace you, for she is as ferocious as she is fetching. I must hope to have this pleasure often repeated, especially when a certain desirable event, my dear Eliza," glancing at her sister and Bingley, "shall take place. What congratulations will then flow in. But let me not interrupt you, sir. You will not thank me for detaining you from the bewitching young lady. Oh, to think of the ways her many skills can be put to amorous employ." Darcy directed his eyes with a very serious expression towards Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. Recovering himself, however, he turned to his partner and said, "Mr. Williams interrupted has made me forget what we were talking of." "I do not think we were speaking at all. Sir William could not have interrupted two people in the room who had less to say for themselves. We have tried 2 or 3 subjects already without success, and what we are to talk of next, I cannot imagine. What think of you of Orientals? He said, smiling. Oh, no, I am sure we've never met the same or had the same feeling towards them. But if that was the case, we may compare our different opinions. I think them a strange lot, both in appearance and custom. Though having studied solely in Japan, I admit that the opinion may be incomplete. I should be most interested in hearing of your time in the company of Chinamen. Again? Japan was still closed borders. Why am I getting so upset about this? This is this is a zombie book. Who really cares? Well, because it's Jane Austen. I think that's why I care. No, I cannot talk of Orientals in a ballroom. My head is always full of something else. The present always occupies. Okay. The present always occupies you in such scenes, does it? Yes, always, she replied, without knowing what she said, for her thoughts had wandered far from the subject. To the pain of Master Liu's glowing brand searing her flesh, to sparing matches with her sisters atop a beam no wider than their swords, as pikes waited to punish an ill-placed foot below. Her mind returning to the present, she suddenly exclaimed, "Yeah, I know it allows me to feel engrossed in the story. It just... I'm pretty sure everybody's gonna get annoyed every time I bring it up, because I'm gonna be bringing it up almost every video. Every stream." Her mind returning to the present, she suddenly exclaimed, "I remember hearing you once say, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgave, that your resentment once created was unappeasable." You are very cautious, I suppose, as to it being created. I am, he said with a firm voice. And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice. I'll take the head pats and the let's see which one is this one? Oh. I mean, the Glock is okay, but the head pats are much more appreciated. The Glock is how I feel every time I read any instance about Japan in this time period, because again, Japan, closed borders. And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice. I hope not. It is peculiarly incumbent on those who never change their opinion to be secure of judging properly at first. May I ask to what these questions tend? Merely to illustrate of your character, said she, endeavoring to shake off her gravity. I am trying to make it out. And what is your success? She shook her head. I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly. I can readily believe, answered him gravely, that reports may vary greatly with respect to me, and I could wish, Miss Bennet, that you were not to sketch my character at the present moment. But if I do not take your likeness now, I may never have another opportunity. I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours, he coldly replied. She said no more, and they went down the other dance and parted in silence, and on each side dissatisfied, though not to an equal degree, for in Darcy's breast there was a tolerable, powerful feeling toward her, which soon procured her pardon, and directed all his anger against another. Elizabeth then sought her eldest sister. I want to know what you have learned about Mr. Wickham, but perhaps you have been too pleasantly engaged to think of any third person, in which case you may be sure of my pardon. No, replied Jane, I have not forgotten him, but I have nothing satisfactory to tell you. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of his history, and is quite ignorant of the circumstances which have principally offended Mr. Darcy. But he will vouch for the good conduct, the probability, and honour of his friend. I am sorry to say by his account Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man. Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself? No, he never saw him till the other morning at Meryton. I have not a doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity, said Elizabeth warmly, but you must excuse my not being convinced by assurances only. Mr. Bingley's defense of his we got a happy doggo. Hi, Coco. No, I'm not. Let's see. But you must excuse me by not being convinced by assurances only. Mr. Bingley's defense of his friend was a very able one, but since he is unacquainted with several parts of the story, I shall venture to still think of both gentlemen as I did before. She then changed the discourse to one more gratifying to each. Elizabeth listened with delight to the happy, though modest hopes which Jane entertained of Mr. Bingley's regard, and said all in her power to heighten her confidence in it. On their being joined by Mr. Bingley himself, Elizabeth drew to Miss Lucas, to whose inquiry after the pleasantness of Darcy she had scarcely replied, before her fat cousin, Mr. Collins, came up to them, and told them with great exultation that he had just been so fortunate as to make a most important discovery. Ah, may I suppose then that you have discovered the location of the buffet? Said Elizabeth rudely. No, I have found out, said he, by a singular accident, that there is now in the room a near relation of my patroness. I happened to overhear the gentleman himself mentioning to the young lady who does the honours of the house the names of his cousin, Miss de Bourgh, and of her mother, Lady Catherine. How wonderfully these sorts of things occur! Who would have thought of my meeting with, perhaps, a nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in this assembly? I am most thankful that the discovery is made in time for me to pay my respects to him, which I am now going to do. Are you not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy? Indeed I am. I shall entreat his pardon for not having done so earlier. I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew. Elizabeth tried hard to dissuade him from such a scheme, assuring him that Mr. Darcy would consider his addressing him without introduction as an impertinent freedom rather than a compliment to his aunt, and that it must belong to Mr. Darcy, the superior in consequence, to begin the acquaintance. When Elizabeth ceased speaking, Mr. Collins replied thus: "My dear Elizabeth, I have the highest opinion in the world in your excellent judgment in all matters within the scope of your understanding, particularly in the slaying of Satan's armies. But permit me to say that there must be a wide difference between such established forms of ceremony amongst the laity and those who regulate the clergy. After all, you may wield God's sword, but I wield his wisdom, and it is wisdom, dear cousin, which will ultimately rid us of our present difficulties with the undead. You will excuse me for saying so, but I have never seen a zombie's head taken off by words, nor do I expect to. You must allow me to follow the dictates of my conscience on this occasion, which leads me to perform what I look on as a point of duty." With a low bow, he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, whose repetition of his advances she eagerly watched, and whose astonishment at being so addressed was evident. We have more reigning. What are we at? Oh yes, there's definitely some pot stirring going on here. Ah, jeez. Okay. With a low bow, he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, whose reception of his advances she eagerly watched, and whose astonishment at being so addressed was very evident. Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though she could not hear the words of it, she felt as if hearing it all, and saw in the motion of his lips the words apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. It vexed her to see him expose himself to such a man. Mr. Darcy was eyeing him with unrestrained wonder, and when at last Mr. Collins allowed him time to speak, replied with an air of distant civility. Mr. Collins, however, was not discouraged from speaking again, and Mr. Darcy's contempt seemed abundantly increasing with the length of his second speech, and at the end of it he only made him a slight bow and moved another way. As Elizabeth had no longer any interest of her own to pursue, she turned her attention almost entirely on her sister and Mr. Bingley. She saw in all her felicity which a marriage of true affection could bestow, and she felt capable, under such circumstances, of endeavoring even to like Bingley's two sisters. Her mother's thoughts were plainly bent in the same way, and she determined not to venture near her, lest she suffer her endless prattling. When they sat down to supper, therefore, Elizabeth considered it a most unlikely perverseness which placed them within one of each other, and deeply was she vexed to find that her mother was talking to Lady Lucas freely, openly, and of nothing else but her expectation that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley. It was an animating subject, and Mrs. Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the advantages of such the match. His being such a charming young man, and so rich, and living but but 3 miles from them was the first point of self-congratulation. And then it was such a comfort to think of how fond the two sisters were of Jane, and to be certain that they must desire the connection as much as she could do. It was, moreover, such a promising thing for her younger daughters, as Jane's marrying so greatly must throw them in the way of other rich men. Oh, what a joy to see them all thus provided for, to see them entertaining at their own estates, raising their own children, instead of all this silly training and fighting. She concluded with many good wishes that Lady Lucas might soon be equally fortunate, though evidently and triumphantly believing that there was no chance. Now let's just have an emote war going on between the two of you. Little gummy bear dance. In vain did Elizabeth endeavor to check the rapidity of her mother's words, or persuade her to describe her felicity in less audible whisper, for to her inexpressible vexation she could perceive that the chief of it was overheard by Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite to them. Her mother only scolded her for being nonsensical, her breath thick with meat and port. "What is Mr. Darcy to me, pray, that I should be afraid of him? I am sure we owe him no particular civility, as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear." "For heaven's sake, madam, speak lower. What advantage can it be for you to offend Mr. Darcy? You will never recommend yourself to his friend by doing so." Nothing that she could say, however, had any influence. Elizabeth blushed, and blushed again, with shame and vexation. She could not help frequently glancing her eye at Mr. Darcy, though every glance convinced her of what she dreaded. For though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was irrevertibly fixed by her. The expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. At length, however, Mrs. Bennet had no more to say, and Lady Lucas, who had been long yearning for the repetition of delights which she saw no likelihood of sharing, was left to the comforts of cold ham and chicken. Elizabeth now began to revive, but not long after the interval of tranquillity, for when supper was over, not a servant was to be found to attend their empty plates. Seeing as his guests grew restless, Mr. Bingley rose from his seat and excused himself, no doubt to scold his steward for the embarrassment. Upon his return, Elizabeth promptly reached for her ankle dagger. Mr. Bingley's white face and troubled countenance were enough to solicit such a reaction. "Mr. Darcy, if I may have the pleasure of your company in the kitchen," said Bingley. Darcy rose, taking care not to move too quickly lest he alarm the guests. Elizabeth took it upon herself to follow him. When Darcy took notice of this, he turned to her and said in a whisper, "Miss Bennet, I would much prefer that you took your seat. I am quite capable of attending to Mr. Bennet myself. Oh, Mr. Bingley myself." "Of that I have no doubt, Mr. Darcy, just as I have no doubt in my ability to form my own opinion on the matter. Now, do you wish to cause a stir, or shall we to the kitchen?" Mr. Bingley led the two of them down a hidden staircase and into the cellar, which was divided into two halves by a long corridor, one side belonging to the servants' quarter and armory, the other to the exercise parlor and kitchen. I mean, I would have the exercise parlor and the armory on one side and the kitchen and the servants' quarter to the others, because you don't really want to exercise in by the kitchen. I mean, you kind of do, easier to get to the food, but I would still think the armory would be better to be closer. It was in the latter that the most unfortunate sight awaited them. Two adult unmentionables, both of them male. Okay, two adult unmentionables, both of them male, busied themselves feasting upon the flesh of the household staff. How two zombies could have killed a dozen servants, 4 maids, 2 cooks, and a steward was beyond Elizabeth's comprehension, but she knew precisely how they gotten in. The cellar door had been opened to let in the cool night air and relieve the oppression of the wood stoves. Well, I suppose we had ought to take all of their heads, lest they be born to darkness, she said. By the way, picture. Here we go. Picture. There you go. And it's nice and bloody. So there's probably why it was banned. Because, yeah, it is very graphic. See if I can get it closer. There we go. The bodies. The bodies. I should probably do a body count. Kind of like a kill count, a la Dead Meat style. Mr. Bingley observed the dessert his poor servants had been attending to at the time of their demise. A delightful array of tarts, exotic fruits, and pies, sadly soiled by blood and brains, and thus unusable. "I don't suppose," said Darcy, "that you would give me the honor of dispensing of this unhappy business alone. I should never forgive myself if your gown was soiled." "The honor is all yours, Mr. Darcy." Elizabeth thought she detected the slightest smile on his face. She watched as Darcy drew his blade and cut down the 2 zombies with savage yet dignified movements. He then made quick work of beheading the slaughtered staff, upon which Mr. Bingley politely vomited into his hands. There was no denying Darcy's talent as a warrior. If only she thought his talents as a gentleman were their equal. When they returned to the ball, they found the spirits of the others very much disturbed. Mary was entertaining them at a pianoforte, her shrill voice testing the patient ears of all present. Elizabeth looked at her father to entreat his interference, lest Mary should be singing all night. He took the hint, and when Mary finished her second song, said aloud, "That will do extremely well, child. You have delighted us long enough. Let the other young ladies have the time to exhibit." To Elizabeth it appeared that had her family made an arrangement to embarrass themselves as much as they could during the evening, it would have been impossible for them to play the parts with more success. The rest of the evening brought her little amusement. She was teased by Mr. Collins, who continued most perversedly by her side, and though he could not prevail on her to dance with him again, he put it out of her power to dance with others, by using his thick middle to hide her from view. In vain did she offer to introduce him to any young lady in the room. He assured her that he was perfectly indifferent to it, that his chief object was by delicate attention to recommend himself to her, and that he should therefore make a point of remaining close to her the whole evening. There was no arguing upon such a project. She owed her greatest relief to her friend Miss Lucas, who often joined them, and good-naturedly engaged Mr. Collins' conversations to herself. She was at least free from the offence of Mr. Darcy's further notice, though often standing within a very short distance of her, quite disengaged. He never came near enough to speak. She felt it to be the probable consequence of her allusions to Mr. Wickham, and rejoiced in it. When at length they arose to take leave, Mrs. Bennet was most pressingly civil in her hopes of seeing the whole family soon at Longbourn, and addressed herself especially to Mr. Bingley to assure him how happy he would make them by eating a family dinner with them at any time, without the ceremony of a formal invitation. Bingley was all grateful pleasure, and he readily engaged for taking the earliest opportunity of waiting on her after his return from London, whither he was obliged to go the next day for a meeting of the Society of Gentlemen for a Peaceful Solution to Our Present Difficulties, which he was a member and patron. Mrs. Bennet was perfectly satisfied, and quitted the house under the delightful persuasion that she should see her daughter settled at Netherfield, her weapons retired forever, in the course of 3 or 4 months. Of having another daughter married to Mr. Collins, she thought with equal certainty, and with considerable, though not equal pleasure. Elizabeth was the least dear to her of all her children, and though the man and the match were quite good enough for her, the worth of each was eclipsed by Mr. Bingley and Netherfield. Oh, geez. Lovely that the second child is the least favorite child. Although, to be fair, Elizabeth is a very testy woman. Definitely not someone her mother would. Okay, so the next. Okay, so chapter 21 is a bit on the longer side. How are we doing for time? Oh, well, good. How am I doing in terms of mouth? It's really hard to do this, I'll admit. I do enjoy it, it's just very hard. The next day opened a new scene at Longbourn. Mr. Collins made his declaration in form. On finding Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, and one of the younger girls together, soon after breakfast, he addressed the mother in these words. May I hope, madam, for your interest with your fair daughter Elizabeth, when I solicit for the honor of a private audience with her in the course of this morning. Before Elizabeth had the time for anything but a blush of surprise, Mrs. Bennet answered instantly, "Oh, yes. Oh dear, yes, certainly, I am sure. Lizzie will be very happy. I am sure she can have no objections. Come, Kitty, I want you upstairs." And gathering her work together, she was hastening away when Elizabeth called out, "Dear madam, do not go. I beg you will not go. Mr. Collins must excuse me. He can have nothing to say to me that anybody need not hear. I am going away myself." "No, nonsense, Lizzie. I desire you to stay where you are." And upon Elizabeth's seeming really, with vexed and embarrassed looks about to escape. Oh God, hold on. This one definitely needs a reread. Hold on. No, nonsense, Lizzie. I desire you to stay where you are. And upon Elizabeth's seeming really, With vexed and embarrassed looks about to escape, she added, "Lizzie, I insist upon you staying and hearing Mr. Collins." Mrs. Bennet and Kitty walked off, and as soon as they were gone, Mr. Collins began. "Believe me, my dear Elizabeth, that your modesty adds to your other perfections. You would have been less amiable in my eyes had there not been this little unwillingness. But allow me to assure you that I have your respected mother's permission for this address. You can hardly doubt the purpose of my discourse, for however preoccupied you might be in hastening the devil's retreat, for which I earnestly applaud you, my intentions have been too marked to be mistaken. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as a companion for my future life. But before I am run away with by my feelings on the subject, perhaps it would be advisable for me to state my reasons for marrying, and moreover, for coming to Hertfordshire with the design of selecting my wife, as I certainly did." The idea of Mr. Collins, with all his solemn composure, being run away with by his feelings, made Elizabeth so near laughing that she could not use the short pause he allowed in any attempt to stop him further, and he continued, "My reasons for marrying are, first, that I think it is a right thing for every clergyman to set an example of matrimony in his parish." "Hey, Chelsea!" "Secondly, I am convinced it will add very greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, Chelsea? Chelsea! No, there's no food up there. Chelsea! No, come here. No, Chelsea, there's no food. There's no food, Chelsea." I don't know if you can see her. No, you can't. That's my cup. No. The cat wants food. You wanna... Yeah? Yeah? It is not dinner time and she wants food. And thirdly, that it is in the particular advice and recommendation of the very noble lady whom I have the honor of calling patroness. It was but the very Saturday night before I left Hunsford that she said, "Mr. Collins, you must marry. A clergy like you must marry. Choose properly. Choose a gentlewoman for my sake, and for your own, let her be an active, useful sort of person, not brought up high, but able to make a small income go a good way. This is my advice. Find such a woman as soon as you can, bring her to Hunsford, and I will visit her. Allow me, by the way, to observe, my fair cousin, that I do not reckon the notice and kindness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh among the least of the advantage in my power to offer. You will find her powers of combat beyond anything I can describe, and your own talents in slaying the stricken, I think, must be acceptable to her, though, naturally, I will require you to retire them as part of your marital submission." It was absolutely necessary to interrupt him now. "You are too hasty, sir," she cried. "You forget that I have made no answer. Let me do it without further loss of time. Accept my thanks for the compliment you are paying me. I am very sensible to the honor of your proposals, but it is impossible for me to do otherwise than to decline them." "I am now to learn," replied Mr. Collins, that it is usual with young ladies to reject the address of the man whom they secretly mean to accept. I forgot how stupid Mr. Collins was. Also, I'm reminded of Middlemarch here, and I think Dodo, no, not Dodo, Dodo's sister is sort of like kind of well, either way, I'm reminded of Middlemarch because, again, this is all talking about marriage and the wording and all of that. I am not now to learn, replied Mr. Collins, that it is usual with the young ladies to reject the address of the man whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favor, and that sometimes the refusal is repeated a second or even third time. I am therefore by no means discouraged by what you have just said, and shall hope to lead you to the altar ere long. You forget, sir, that I am a student of Shaolin, master of the 7-star fist. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You cannot make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who can make you so. Nay, were your friend, Lady Catherine, to know me, I am persuaded she would find me in every aspect ill qualified for the situation. For I am a warrior, sir, and shall be until my last breath is offered to God. Were it certain that Lady Catherine would think so, said Mr. Collins very gravely, but I cannot imagine that her ladyship would at all disapprove of you. And you may be certain when I have the honor of seeing her again, I shall speak in the very highest terms of your modesty, economy, and other amiable qualifications. Indeed, Mr. Collins, all praise of me will be unnecessary. You must give me leave to judge for myself, and pay me the compliment of believing what I say. I wish you very happy and very rich, and by refusing your hand, do all in my power to prevent you being otherwise. And rising as she thus spoke, she would have quitted the room had Mr. Collins not thus addressed her. When I do myself the honors of speaking to you next on the subject, I shall hope to receive a more favorable answer than you have now given me. I know it will be to established custom of your sex to reject a man on the first application. Really, Mr. Collins, cried Elizabeth, you puzzle me exceedingly. If what I have hitherto said can appear to you in the form of encouragement, I know not how to express my refusal in such a way to convince you of it being one. You must give me leave to flatter myself, my dear cousin, that your refusal of my address is merely words of course. To such perseverance in wilful self-deception, Elizabeth would make no reply, and immediately and in silence withdrew, determined, if he persisted in considering her repeated refusal as flattering encouragement, to apply to her father, whose negative might be uttered in such a manner as to be decisive, and whose behavior, at least, cannot be mistaken for the affection and coquetry of an elegant female. Chapter 20. Mr. Collins was not left long in the silent contemplation of his successful love. For Mrs. Bennet, having dawdled about in the vestibule to watch for the end of the conference, no sooner saw Elizabeth open the door, and with quick step pass her towards the staircase, than she entered the breakfast room, and congratulated both him and herself in warm terms on the happy prospect of their near connection. Mr. Collins received and returned the felicitations with equal pleasure, and then proceeded to relate the particulars of their interview. This information startled Mrs. Bennet, who would have been glad to be equally satisfied that her daughter had meant to encourage him by protesting against his proposals, but she dared not believe it and could not help saying so. But depend upon it, Mr. Collins, she added, that Lizzie shall be brought to reason. I will speak to her about it directly. She is a very headstrong, foolish girl and does not know her own interest, but I will make her know of it. Oh, God. She is old enough to know what she wants, Mrs. Bennet. Yeah. Pretty much, if I read this, if I read the original version right after this, I swear to God, it would just be literally the same thing. It says, Bennet, get your head, and Colin, get your head out of your asses. Elizabeth says no, she does not want you. She will not want you. Well, we all know she's going to end up with Mr. Darcy. You know, it's actually kind of funny. I'm going to side tangent here. The Taylor Swift song Love Story, I know she mentions Romeo and Juliet, which is probably the more fitting for that song. But I still have to laugh because it's Romeo and Juliet. They both end up dead at the end. I think it would have been more equally entertaining if she had used Elizabeth and Darcy. Just because they're not trying to run away together. They're just both butting heads and being stupid. Hurrying instantly to her husband, she called out as she entered the library, "Oh, Mr. Bennet, you are wanted immediately. We are all in an uproar. You must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she vows she will not have him." Mr. Bennet raised his eyes from his book as she entered and fixed them on her face with a calm unconcern. "I have not the pleasure of understanding you," he said when she had finished her speech. "Of what are you talking?" "Of Mr. Collins and Lizzie. Lizzie declares she will not have Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins begins to say that he will not have Lizzie." "And what am I to do on the occasion? It seems a hopeless business." "Speak to Lizzie about it yourself. Tell her that you insist upon you marrying him." "Let her be calmed down. She shall hear my opinion." Mrs. Bennet rang the bell, and Miss Elizabeth was summoned to the library. "Come here, child," cried her father as he appeared. "I have sent for you in an affair of importance. I understand that Mr. Collins had made you an offer of marriage. It is true?" Elizabeth replied that it was. "Very well. And this offer of marriage you have refused?" "I have, sir." "Very well. We now come to the point. Your mother insists upon your accepting it. Is that so, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, or I will never see her again." "An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do. For I shall not have my best warrior resigned to the service of a man who is fatter than Buddha and duller than the edge of a learning sword." Okay, that's a good insult. I want to keep it. Do I have a page marker? I don't have. This is one of the reasons why I don't want to highlight books that I might possibly sell. But oh yes, I do. I do have a possible bookmark. You know what? I'm gonna highlight it just so that whoever gets this book next will get a good laugh. Let's mark it in. There we go. There's a marker. There's a highlighter. But I shall not have my best boy resigned to the service of a man who's fatter than Buddha and duller than the edge of a learning sword. Okay, now I kind of want to see what is said in the original book. But there. That is a keeper. Elizabeth could not but smile at such a conclusion of such a beginning, but Mrs. Bennet, who had persuaded herself that her husband regarded the affair as she wished, was excessively disappointed. "What do you mean, Mr. Bennet, in talking this way?" "My dear," replied her husband, "I have 2 small favors to request. First, that you spare me at the expense of having your lips sewn shut. And secondly, that you will allow me the free use of my room. I shall be glad to have the library to myself as soon as may be." Not yet, however, did Mrs. Bennet give up the point. She talked to Elizabeth again and again, coaxed and threatened her by turns. She endeavored to secure Jane in her interests, but Jane, with all possible mildness, declined interfering, and Elizabeth, sometimes with real eagerness, and sometimes with playful gaiety, replied to her attacks. Though her manner varied, however, her determination never did. While the family were in such this confusion, Charlotte Lucas came to spend the day with them. She was met in the vestibule by Lydia, who cried in a half-whisper, "I'm glad you are come, for there's such fun here. What do you think has happened this morning? Mr. Collins has made an offer to Lizzie, and she will not have him." Lydia noticed that Charlotte was flushed with the warmth of exercise, and had a rather disconcerted look on her face. "Charlotte, are you ill?" Charlotte hardly had time to answer before they were joined by Kitty, who came to tell them the same news, and no sooner had they entered the breakfast room, where Mrs. Bennet was alone, than she likewise began on the subject, calling on Miss Lucas for her compassion, and entreating her to persuade her friend Lizzie to comply with the wishes of her family. "Pray do, my dear Miss Lucas," she added in melancholy tone, "for nobody is on my side, nobody takes part with me, and I am cruelly used. Nobody feels for my poor nerves." I wish I had a fan, because I just can be like, oh, no, I did not have my fan in here. No, I could just have my fan. It's like, nobody thinks of my poor nerves. I'm gonna just see Miss Bennet doing that. Charlotte's reply was spared by the entrance of Jane and Elizabeth. "Ah, there she comes," continues Miss Bennet, looking as unconcerned as may be, and caring for no more for us than if we were the very unmentionables she takes such pleasure in occupying her time with. But I tell you, Miss Lizzie, if you take into your head to go on refusing every offer of marriage in this way, you will never get a husband at all, and I am very sure I do not know who is to maintain you when your father is dead." Chapter 21. The discussion of Mr. Collins' offer was now nearly at an end. The gentleman himself scarcely spoke to her, and his assiduous attentions were transferred for the rest of the day to Miss Lucas, whose civility in listening to him was a seasonable relief to them all. especially to her friend. Indeed, Charlotte seemed to flatter Mr. Collins with almost unnatural attentiveness. The morrow produced no abatement of Mrs. Bennet's ill humor or ill health. Mr. Collins was also in the state of angry pride. Elizabeth had hoped that his resentment might shorten his visit, but his plan did not appear in the least affected by it. He was always to have gone on Sunday. No, he was always to have gone on Saturday, and to Saturday he meant to stay. After breakfast, the girls retired to the dojo and attended their midweek musket disassembly and cleaning. With those very weapons on their person, they next set out to Meryton to require if Mr. Wickham had returned, and to lament over his absence from the Netherfield ball. They were less than a mile from Longbourn when Kitty, who had elected to take point, abruptly stopped and signaled for the others to do so as well. She raised her musket, but at what Elizabeth and the other girls knew not, for the road seemed free of trouble. After standing thus for a few moments, a single chipmunk scurried out of the woods on their right. It darted across their path with considerable rapidity before disappearing into the woods on the left. Lydia could not help but laugh at this sight. "My dear Kitty, how shall we ever thank you for sparing our toes the most unfortunate tickling?" But Kitty kept her musket at the ready, and after a moment a second chipmunk scurried across the road with equal alacrity. It was followed in short order by a pair of weasels, then a skunk, then a fox and her pups. More creatures followed, and in an ever-increasing numbers, as if Noah himself beckoned, offering refuge from some unseen flood. By the time deer began to leap across their path, the other girls had their musket trained on the tree line, ready for the herd of zombies they suspected would appear at any moment. The first was young, freshly dead female, in a white lace wedding gown, which, like her skin, was surprisingly white, almost shockingly so, save for the bright red rubies that dripped from her mouth and onto the lace covering her bosom. Kitty put the creature down with a shot to the face, upon which Lydia placed her barrel against its head, and promptly dispatched it to hell. So close was this shot that the bride's hair was set alight by the powder's flash. "Seems a waste," said Lydia, as acrid smoke began to rise. "Wasting a perfectly good wedding clothes like that." The wail of another zombie interrupted her, his flowing white beard and half-eaten face attached to a stout body, which was clad in blood-crusted blacksmith's apron. Elizabeth and Jane aimed and discharged their muskets, Jane's ball finding one of the creature's eyes, and Elizabeth striking its neck, cutting through the brittle flesh and separating head from body. "Chelsea, you want to join me? Chelsea? No? No? Well, she's still hungry." These zombies were followed by several more, each vanquished as quickly as the last, until the crackling of powder was at last silent. Sensing the danger past, the sisters lowered their barrel and spoke of setting off again for Meryton. But these plans were belated by the most unusual noise from behind the tree line. It was a shrill, shrieking, neither human nor animal, and yet unlike any zombie wail the sisters had ever heard. It grew closer, and once again all muskets were trained and ready. But when the sword... Chelsea! One moment. Okay, she's back. Well, I'm back. She's eating. Yes, she won the fight. Usually it's, we have... We usually have food out for them. But, today I guess not. Oh, I had to put it out. Okay, but when the source of the strange noise revealed itself, their barrels were loaded. Oh, no, said Jane. Oh, it simply cannot be. A long, dead female zombie stumbled out of the woods, her modest clothing slightly tattered, her brittle hair pulled back so tightly that it began to tear the skin of her forehead. In her arms she held something exceedingly rare, something none of the sisters had ever seen or wished to see. An unmentionable infant. It clawed at the female's flesh, emitting the most unpleasant series of shrieks. Elizabeth raised her musket, but Jane was quick to grab the barrel. You mustn't! Have you forgotten your oath? It's an infant, Lizzie. A zombie infant. No more alive than the musket I mean to silence it with. Elizabeth again raised her weapon and aimed. The female dreadful was now more than halfway across the road. She trained her sights on the elder's head, her fingers caressing the trigger. She would put it down, reload, and dispense of them both. All she had to do was squeeze. And yet, she did not. There was a strange force at work, a feeling she faintly recalled from her earliest days, before she had first traveled to Shaolin. It was a curious feeling, something akin to shame, but without the dishonor of defeat. A shame that demanded no vengeance. Could there be honor in mercy, she wondered? It contradicted everything she had been taught, every warrior's instinct she possessed. Why then could she not fire? Hopelessly bemused, Elizabeth lowered her musket, and the zombies continued into the woods until they were seen no more. It was agreed that none of them would ever speak of it. Wickham joined the sisters on their entering the town and attended to them to their aunt's, where his regret and vexation and concern upon hearing of the regrettable fate of Mr. Bingley's household staff was well talked over. To Elizabeth, however, he voluntarily acknowledged that the necessity of his absence had been self-imposed. I found, said he, as the time grew near that I had better not meet Mr. Darcy, that to be in the same room with the very man who crippled me for a 12-month might be more than I could bear, and that scenes may arise unpleasant to more than myself. Elizabeth highly approved of his forbearance, which was greater than her own, for she confessed that a duel would have almost certainly ensued had she been in his place. Wickham and another officer walked back with him to Longbourn, and during the walk he particularly attended to her. His accompanying them was a triple advantage: the compliment of his attention, an occasion of introducing him to her father and mother, and the presence of an extra warrior should they encounter trouble on the road. Soon after their return, a letter was delivered to Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield. The envelope contained a sheet of elegant little hot-pressed paper, well covered with a lady's fair, flowing hand, and Elizabeth saw her sister's countenance change as she read it, and saw her dwelling intently on some particular passages. This was from Caroline Bingley. What it contained has surprised me a good deal. The whole party has left Netherfield by this time and are on their way to town, and without any intention of coming back again. Nope. Nope. Can I... There we go. Well, yeah, I've returned a while ago. I don't know where you wandered off to. You have returned. I don't know where have you been, mister. Okay. She then read the sentence out loud, which comprised of the information of their leaving, just resolved to follow their brother to town directly, and of their meaning to dine in Governor Street, where Mr. Hurst had a house. The next was in these words: I do not pretend to regret anything I shall leave in the perilous, zombie-covered country, except your society, my dear friend. But we will hope, at some future period, to enjoy many returns of that delightful intercourse we have known, and in the meantime may lessen the pain of separation by very frequent and most unreserved correspondence. I depend on you for that. To these high-flown expressions Elizabeth listened with all the insensibility of distrust, and though the suddenness of their removals surprised her, she saw nothing to lament. It is unlucky, she said, that you should not be able to see your friends before they leave the country. But may we not hope that the period of future happiness, to which Miss Bingley looks forward, may arrive earlier than she is aware? For that delightful intercourse you have known as friends will be renewed with yet greater satisfaction as sisters. Mr. Bingley will not be detained in London by then. Carolina decidedly said that none of the parties will return onto Hertfordshire this winter. I will read it to you. When my brother left us yesterday, he imagined that the business which took him to London might be concluded in 3 or 4 days, but we are certain it cannot be so. Many of my acquaintances are already there for the winter. I wish that I could hear that you, my dearest friend, had any intention of making one of the crowd, but of that I despairs. I sincerely hope your Christmas in Hertfordshire may abound in the gaieties that which this season generally brings, and be not the least bit similar to Christmas of 2 years past, which resulted in so many unpleasantries. It was evident by this, added Jane, that he comes back no more this winter. It is only evident that Miss Bingley does not mean that he should, said Elizabeth. Mr. Bingley is his own master. Perhaps the sight of his bloodied staff was too much for his delicate character, but you do not know all. I will read you the passage which particularly hurts me. Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and we are scarcely less eager to meet her again. I really do not think Georgina Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and the skill in the deadly arts, and the affection she inspires in Louisa and myself is heightened from the hope that we dare entertain her being hereafter our sister. My brother admires her greatly already. He will have frequent opportunities now of seeing her on the most intimate footing. With all of these circumstances to favor an attachment, and nothing to prevent it, am I wrong, my dearest Jane, in indulging the hope of an event which will secure the happiness of so many? What do you think of this sentence, my dear Lizzie? Said Jane as she finished it. Is it not clear enough? Does it not expressly declare that Caroline neither expects nor wishes me to be her sister? That she is perfectly convinced of her brother's indifference, and that if she suspects the nature of my feelings for him, she means, most kindly, to put me on my guard? Can there be any other opinion on the subject? Yes, there can be, but mine is totally different. Will you hear it? Most willingly. You shall have it in a few words. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. I dare say she means to keep you from his attentions. Your honor demands she be slain. Jane shook her head. You forget yourself, Lizzie. Jane, no one who has ever seen you together can doubt his affection. Miss Bingley, I am sure, cannot. She may not be a warrior, but she has cunning enough. Dearest sister, I implore you, this unhappiness is best remedied by the hasty application of a cutlass to her throat. If we thought alike, replied Jane, my honor would be restored at the expense of losing Mr. Bingley's affection forever. And what, pray, would be the purpose? Caroline is incapable of willfully deceiving anyone, and all that I can hope in this case is that she is deceiving herself. Is it she who deceived, or you? You forget yourself, Jane. You have allowed your feelings for Mr. Bingley to soften the instincts bestowed upon our Oriental masters. I have issues with the word Oriental, but the thing is, this is kind of how it was done in that time, so it's kind of accurate. Though they could not agree on a course of action, Jane and Elizabeth agreed that Mrs. Bennet should only hear of the departure of the family. But even this partial communication gave her a great deal of concern, and she bewailed it as exceedingly unlucky that the ladies should happen to go away just as they were all getting so intimate together. After lamenting it, however, at some length, she had the consolation that Mr. Bingley would be soon down again and soon dining at Longbourn, and the conclusion of all was the comfortable declaration that though he had been invited only to a family dinner, she would take care to have 2 full courses. Let's see, Okay. No, I'm getting a little tired, so we'll end it there. Alright. I have a cat who's Chelsea. Hey, hi. Hey, yeah. Hey. Well, she also wants out. Alright, so I'll wrap it up here. Thank you for coming and listening, my little dragonettes. I will see you next week. Hopefully with better weather. But, bye.